This week on the BackTable podcast.
The need to educate, I can't stress that enough, Mark. It's true. It's the attorney's case. We don't own it. I'm not connected to any particular outcome. That's something very important to understand. But at the same time, you have to do your own due diligence as an expert to say, did I educate this attorney so that he truly can talk about this literature correctly? Did I educate him that he understands these basic concepts behind risk factors for dehiscence? Can he intelligently walk himself through questions that he asks a doctor about surgery? And so that's the piece where we have to be integral. We have to participate. Otherwise, the case loses objectivity. And then all of a sudden, you can induce bias due to emotion and non-scientific information entering the picture.
This is your host, Mark Hoffman, and we've got a great guest today with us, Dr. Elizabeth Moore. She is a general OBGYN and founder of MooreExperts, and we're going to talk about medical legal work. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's my pleasure and honor to be here. Welcome to all my colleagues.
It's an important topic, one that if we've dealt with this stuff, it's probably too much, but it's always nice to get somebody here who has been doing it for a while to help us better understand it. But as we like to do with all our guests, we like to let them sort of tell their story a little bit, how they got to be doing what they're doing, and tell our listeners a little bit about how they got to be where they are.
Well, for starters, it's going on about 10 years now for the expert witness work, and I got into it. It was just a real turning point for me. I went through something toward the end of the pandemic. I'm sure all of us can relate to working. I was up at about 70 to 90 hours every single week, and I was between two hospitals. And at the time, I had a nonverbal 25-year-old son with autism. And the reality is that they had to send him home. There were no resources for him. So it was Christmas Eve, and I brought my son home, and we're in this little house near a beach in Cape Cod. It's a great place. And I just was at a turning point because I asked myself, how can I add value? How can I add value for myself, for my son, for my colleagues? I felt very isolated out there, literally going from, our full throttle generalist practice, well over 70 hours a week, to going back home and saying, what now? And so I share this story because I feel that, like I said, it transformed the way I saw my OBGYN career. And to go from that 70 to 90 hours, and then all of a sudden be able to scale it back to my choosing. Some weeks I'd work 24 hours, other weeks I'd do more, do less, but be at a place where I could still preserve my earnings and my sanity. And I thought to myself, my colleagues called me and said, hey, you've helped so many of us get started in expert witness work. Why don't you do a course? Why don't you share and why don't we build a platform the goal is to build a platform of approximately 300 OBGYNs to be in the community as a resource. And the goal is not only to help provide standard of care opinions, but it's about not just justice for patients, it's about justice for physicians and the process and respect of that. So that's essentially how this all started. A buddy of mine from Florida, Mr. Chris Martin, very talented gentleman, helped me put the course together. And you could imagine I'd put my son to sleep, because he's in his 20s, but he's about 5 or 6 years old, emotionally and mentally. So I'd put him to sleep. 3 o'clock in the morning would come. I'd wake up, put my suit on, start recording my class. And I did that for a year, just getting up at 3 in the morning and getting out there and structuring this class to share with my colleagues.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was your experience prior to that? I think, and we can get into the pandemic here in a little bit and how that changed sort of how we think about work, many of us, but like, what was your background in just medical legal work? Was this something you've done a lot of?
Well, actually, my initial interest was when I literally had a case. I went through a case where I was in Las Vegas. I was a solo practitioner there for about 10 years, and I was sued. It was over a Group A sepsis case where the patient apparently, had come in to us, had no insurance. And we said to her, well, you need your prenatal cultures, you need all your obstetrical care. Well, I'd like to wait until I have a job. Well, the reality is she came through our doors to labor and delivery at about 22 weeks. And she was in DIC so severely and crying out, but her I'll never forget it, her tears were blood. Okay, it was just that compelling. And, we knew when I first saw her at her first OB visit that she had a section for chorioamnionitis. And I remember saying to her on the first visit, and I documented this, of course, and said to her, we really need to do some cultures, figure out if we can get any information about why this happened to you previously. So those were refused. And so all we could really do was treat now what was in front of us. And sadly, the outcome, we gave her 33 units of blood, I was working on her in the OR for about 14 or 15 hours with one of our trauma MFMs, able to preserve the uterus. But of course, we were in a Catholic hospital at the time, and we had to do a hysterotomy and terminate the pregnancy at 22 weeks. And despite all of our very best efforts, we had perfusionists, and the room was just packed with professionals, everyone on their A game. And it's true that in medicine, despite everything on an algorithm and done just perfectly, things can still happen. We're human. And this patient, they could not open, when she was in such bad septic shock, they could not open this perforation to her lower extremity, and she underwent amputation. And so I was sitting in this lawsuit being sued because this woman had amputations. And so I testified. I was deposed a little over, I'm going to say 10 to 12 hours, sitting there answering questions. And at the end of all of this, we were able to show in the record that everything humanly possible to be done was done. And the outcome ended up me being dismissed with no settlement, but it was an enormously laborious process. And the opposing counsel walked up to me and said, Dr. Moore, you may have an aptitude for this. I want to give you my card. I'd like to send you some work. And I was dumbfounded, really, because Mark, I'd never thought about this as a career. Never dawned on me. I was the one being sued. So that's how I kind of got an idea that I may want to consider this line of, I'm going to say, work that is more of a addition to our professional skill sets. I really see this work, Mark, as an extension of our OBGYN skills. It really is. And so to answer your question, that's how I got started. And then about 2014-15 came around, and I was doing some risk management courses. One of the things that I'm sure we all share this, those listening, we enjoy keeping our patients safe. We really do. That's, that's a source of fulfillment for us. I really believe that. And so I took more programs. There are all types of programs. One is through Seek. There's another one that's offered with a radiologist. She gives a program. But these are general programs, meaning you can sign up for an online course and you learn how to be a medical expert. There isn't anything tailored to OBGYN. And the reason it needs to be, Mark, is that OBGYN is a completely different animal, so to speak, when it comes to reviewing a record and presenting. We have to educate juries. This is material that, I'm going to present you to a jury, and this jury, Mark, is going to have 8 men and 2 women. And we're going to go up there and we're going to talk to them about intrauterine fetal demise. Okay? This is something that you don't hear so much in the lay discussion. So we really are educators, and it requires a special type of effort, a different effort than other specialties. It also requires you to educate attorneys. Many of them take these cases and they are searching for really the essence of what the case is. You know, just recently I testified at a trial that boiled down to one question. What did they want the doctor to do? And the answer was to send the patient to the emergency room. And were the criteria met to send the patient to the ER from the outpatient setting? That's it. Those were two questions that were posed, and that was the essence of the case. So many of the attorneys need you to break a case down to show them, you know, where the focus is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that many of us probably participate in this work. If we've been sued, some of us, I've been, the limited work that I've done was, a referral for something. And I'm a gynecologist. I don't do obstetrics. It seems very different to me to do the obstetrics work than the GYN work. GYN seems more sort of perioperative and surgical. That being said, I think there is, to your point, much of my experience with this work is educating the lawyers. It is, that have hired you. Okay, help me out. And I think taking a step back a little bit, I mean, that the work for me, and you said, I think very eloquently, the idea that, we're advocating for our patients and we're advocating for our colleagues. The goal is not to try to, game anybody. That's the lawyer's job. Our job is to be, as educators, to try to understand the case and communicate in a way that our legal colleagues can then help their client make a better decision. Because if somebody's screwed up, saying, "Oh, I'll defend it and go to trial," that doesn't help anybody if it's a not defensible thing, right? You need to help. You need to be
indeed
able to sleep at night when you do this work. And so I think that's something that I've been lucky. I've got a family member who's done a lot of this work and got some sort of tips on how to do it in the little bit that I've done. But it does feel very fulfilling. It does feel like I am sort of contributing in a way that is not better or worse than patient care. It feels like this is a necessary thing.
It really is. I had a case of cervical cancer in a 36-year-old out west where there was a delay in diagnosis that was very clear for 14 months. And the patient had been in the ER, and the OBGYN on call decided to order a CT scan when the patient had this history of postcoital bleeding. And the reality is the CAT scan did not comment at all upon the cervix. And literally 8 months later, she went to another practitioner and they were identifying invasion into the bladder. And, the imaging wasn't adequate. I mean, and the CT was not adequate. And so MR wasn't ordered. There wasn't a pelvic exam. And so, it's not that we're out to go after any particular individual. There are cases every day that I call a counsel and say, the doctor did everything they could here. They've met the standard of care. And that's a word I'd like to introduce into the podcast tonight. Standard of care. What would the majority of board certified OBGYNs do with this? I mean, that's the standard. Just this is the statute, if you would, that you're held to.
My understanding was that it's not that you have to be perfect. It's that if it's like sort of C- care, like anything. We're all, I think, trained, and we go to school and we're type A and we're, some of us perfectionists. M&M in academic settings is like, if you make one little mistake, we're all going to come down. But in a legal sense,
no, it's reasonable degree of medical certainty.
That's it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's sort of, I was like below C- care, that if you did something reasonable on the way, and even to take one step back further for definitions, like malpractice, right? So it is a deviation from the standard of care, right? Number one.
Correct.
And two, there has to be an injury or not even physical, but there has to be something that happened to the person. You can't say, well, you screwed up, but I'm totally fine, right? That's not malpractice, right? It is, and the last piece is my understanding is that the error had to contribute to that bad thing that happened, right? You could mess one thing up, they had a complication separately, unrelated, and so that was how I was educated. Is that a explanation of how to approach this work in a sense, or this sort of a doctor's definition of malpractice?
It is. And basically, when we formulate our opinion, it's within a reasonable degree of medical certainty. So this isn't some lofty standard somewhere, an academic standard or anything else. And it's important to appreciate that along with standard of care. So as I mentioned, this patient with cervical cancer, she had a delay in diagnosis. The point of this course that I did was to show OBGYNs that there is a way that you can write your reports. When you review a record, you write a report and you get the point across so that when you submit this and the attorneys look at it, you're really more likely to come to a settlement as opposed to having to always go to trial. And what we were able to do in that case is to achieve a settlement. And then in that settlement, we were able to get this patient care. She actually went to where my residency program was at Sinai Hopkins Health System. But it was rewarding because at least now we can get her the care she needs. It's going to be funded. And that's the really rewarding part of this.
You mentioned, it sounds like you're a little more involved in, when you said, when we got her a settlement, that you're a little more involved in steering a case in a sense, where I think some may say, well, I'm just the medical, expert. I'll provide an opinion and let the lawyers decide how to manage the case, settlement versus trial versus, all I guess, the legal toolbox that many of us are less familiar with. But it sounds like you might have a bit more involvement in that sense. Is that accurate? Am I reading into that?
Well, Mark, I'd like to make a clarification. First of all, the attorney owns the case. Okay. When I give my master class online, I refer to the expert as like if you have a football game and you have the referee, and they're really not representing either team. They're making the call on the actual plays of the game. And that's what we're called to do. However, we can write our reports as a function of the record, meaning that so many times I see letters from medical experts where they're stating their opinion, but they're not bringing in any facts from the record. They're emotional. They're not really based on anything. They're not talking about any ACOG technical bulletins. If it's postpartum hemorrhage, they're not discussing the California Collaborative. They're not referring to anything other than what they may feel about a case. And so my point is I show you in this masterclass how to compile a report that truly reflects the record. And when that happens, something great happens for the attorneys. They're able to intelligently figure out what the next step should be. And that's why, for example, in 10 years, I think I've been in trial, 3 or 4 times. That's it. Because over,
How many cases would you say that's out of?
Oh, wow. Hundreds.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the reality is that when that occurs, first of all, it's less required of you, because when there's a trial preparation, you may have to travel, you may have to do other, it's a much more intensive type of preparation. It requires coaching, all types of communication skills, etc. But the good news with going through, you write a report, you do a deposition where they ask you questions about your report. And as long as you're presenting that based on the record and it's very well prepared and coherent, the chance of that going to trial is much smaller. And that's what I aim for in helping my colleagues. It's just such an added benefit that your cases don't always have to progress to that extent.
So I have sort of a more general question about this. This is something that I've talked at length about with medical and legal friends, I find it interesting that in medicine, we have a jury of our peers. And not that we are better than anyone, but what we do is complex. It takes a decade or, for many of us to begin to do our work. And some might argue that a jury of folks who are not in healthcare, not in medicine, from a content perspective are not our peers, right? Tax law, right? Tax law is not, the jury in a tax law case is not a journey of lay people. It's too complicated for me or you.
Correct.
To be jurors in a tax case because tax law is too complicated. Yet medical malpractice cases are simple, right? And that's one of the things that I've thought about for years. Like, what are your thoughts on the role of how these cases are tried in a sense and sort of how the cases are designed to be presented to folks without a medical background, right? Because they really represent in their experience, the patients. That's been their experience in their life is in their sense the plaintiff's side.
Their reference point, yes.
So thank you. Yeah,
when
that's
you're
exactly
looking
right.
when you're looking at jury selection, there's an incredible risk with that, only because we don't particularly have control over how many men are on the jury, how many women. If you have a jury of women, predominantly, they may relate to, I have an OBGYN, I have care every year. They'll have a little more understanding. But, imagine me going to Florida for a trial on a case where it was a registered nurse who underwent a labiaplasty, and her results were horrifically disfiguring. And the argument being made to the jury is, well, she's overweight, so her surgery results aren't going to be the optimal results. So here I am arriving, showing the jury. So we had 8 men on the jury and 2 women, and getting up there with my, my green screen.
You have to give an anatomy lesson.
Things. I do. And then I have to show them, this is a surgery, this is before surgery and after. And we have to do before and after maybe 20 times and say, does anyone have questions so far about, well, okay, now let's look at the pictures of the plaintiff before and after. But it takes me an enormous amount of not just time and effort, but it's an educating skill. We're being relied upon to not influence the jury. It's not influencing them. It's just like you said, I have to get them to a point where they can even understand what's going on. And that is where trial is so difficult. And for me, I really prefer to study a case, write a report, do a deposition where I write a report that is very straightforward and reflects the record. And that to me is far more rewarding because I can help more people, I can do more cases and then devote the time to trial. And I wish I could tell you that every result makes sense in trial. That's another thing. So I've had far more satisfaction in watching the process of deposition, report writing, and then are they able to arbitrate and settle this situation where at least the patient can benefit?
Yeah, because there are no winners in malpractice, right? That's the thing. I think that we assume, and I think rightfully so, that most physicians are trying to do right by patients. And this myth of perfectibility, this idea that you need to go through this entire career without making a single mistake, that's impossible. Correct. There are systems errors that individuals make as a result of imperfect systems, right? And I think that's something that we don't do a good enough job of owning that piece of it, but you can't sue hospitals. It's oftentimes the individual, right? So thinking about the idea that this is a doctor who's worked hard and this terrible thing happened, they're already feeling bad as it is. The patient
Indeed.
Was harmed, and that's terrible. And the impact to them is real. And where is that space in the universe where they can both come and go, okay, this seems reasonable and fair. But I guess, what I hear about, and again, much of this is informal. I don't have a ton of experience with it, but thinking about just the incentives, the people advising the patients, the plaintiffs, are incentivized to get more money. right? Oftentimes these are cases where lawyers are taking a percent. Was that typically the situation in malpractice cases, right? Lawyers are going to get a percent of whatever is won at trial or is settled. Is that right?
Typically, yes. And the cases that I've been involved in, I'm about 50-50. And that's kind of ideal as a medical expert.
Plaintiff defendant, 50-50.
Yeah, 50-50 in terms of who we're representing. And the other huge advantage of this work is we can choose the cases that we feel are the best fit for us. These cases are not thrust upon you. You don't have to, and take every single case. And I think I want to point that out as well, and the flexibility involved. None of us, I feel that women and children are the fabric of our society. And, I've raised a wonderful young man who is, we just love him and his disability. He's just the best. And I always tell my colleagues and my friends, my son gives you a gift. You won't know what it is right away, but he'll teach you something about yourself. And the reason I share this with you is because we went into this field. We believe women and children are the fabric of society. We want to celebrate women and children and hold them up. That's day one what I signed up for. And 33 years later, I can still say that. But what I never wish to ever imply is that we do any of this for money. So I want to make that very, very clear. But we have to pay our bills and we have to raise our families and survive. And so I point out this because, as a hospitalist or a generalist, on average, we're at about 200-ish an hour somewhere. Medical expert witness work begins somewhere between $600 and $650 an hour. Subspecialties such as MIGs and others will go well over between $800 and $1,100 per hour to review cases. Not only that, there's a huge backlog of cases, especially since the pandemic. And we talk about cases, and I want to just interject for a moment, just some basic vocabulary, because I think it will help us going forward for us to understand, well, what is retaining counsel? Retaining counsel is the counsel that hires yourself. So hires you or hires me. That's retaining. Opposing counsel, obviously, is for the other party. So I want to make sure that we point those terms out. And then the other thing I want to point out is that we're not always representing an actual case. We might be doing peer review. I helped and contributed to forming a lactation protocol for the federal prison system. They were noticing that there was a strong need for this. So we're not always called to evaluate a case. We may be asked to set a new standard. We may be asked to give an opinion and evaluate our peers. The other thing I wish to share with everyone this evening is the fact that, when we are doing this work, this is work that we really we owe it to our community to be a platform, to perform in a manner that we can collaborate with each other. And that's the whole purpose of what I'm trying to accomplish. And I can tell you the individuals so far that I've been working with and helping them get started, it's a lot of fun. We really challenge each other. And there's an aspect of it that just sharpens the saw. If anyone told me that I would, go into labor floor and everyone says to me, "You're the happiest doctor showing up," I said, well, that's because I actually may have some sleep and some control over my schedule. And I share this because, burnout is real, Mark. And I see so many of my colleagues that really owe it to themselves to just think about what other avenues and how they could use their skill set.
So I think talking about, why we do this work, why we get into this work, certainly folks can make money. That's something that it's not that it's the only reason to do it. Certainly it is a way for us. I think for me, it was also it's something interesting. It's something new. It's a break, as you said, from the routine clinical work. How does somebody get into this work? I mean, I think obviously taking courses and being part of a group like this is one way. For everybody else out there, folks can certainly look you up and Your site will be in our show notes. But in general, how does somebody get involved? Because one of the other things I hear is you don't want to go advertise yourself as someone who does this, because that's something that a lot of times not that you don't want to, but oftentimes they ask, do you sort of like advertise yourself in this work, or did they just find you, right? And I think that's something that is weighed in all this. So how does someone get started?
Sure. So what I do in the master class is I go through what are considered the reputable advertisement sources, okay? Because there are some that are very well respected in terms of advertisement. And what I would encourage those listening, if you're thinking that this may be an avenue for your career, a way you'd like to have your skill sets evolve, just simply pick up the phone and call me. I have a calendar link. You're welcome to set up a call. And, I wish to, explain what this call entails. All we really do is we talk about your situation and whether or not you're at a point in your career where it would be advantageous to consider this work. And on that phone call, I've made some wonderful connections, and not everyone is able to participate. We had one physician, lovely gal. She basically had a car accident and ended up with thoracic outlet syndrome, and she can't do any surgery anymore. And so kind of puts her out of the medical expert witness realm. However, I was able to find her connection over at Exam Pro to help with oral boards and to do some telemedicine work, because she just didn't feel ready to leave OBGYN. And, she was physically limited. So, you may get on the call with me and we may just have a conversation about it's really about how to meet new colleagues and how to build a platform. And, I made a friend for life over there because, I hear from her every couple of weeks and she's doing fabulous. And it's a platform where we're helping and we're supporting each other. And it's about time. We really need it. The one thing I would stress is that once you start doing this work, like Tony Robbins says, you're going to see patterns over and over again that lead to lawsuits. And once you recognize those patterns, like when you go through, that's again what this master class is about. I show you the patterns. I give you something called the OBGYN toolkit. And it's a living document, living, breathing. It's about 20 reports. And what it does is it shows you what are the patterns of cases that enter litigation. How does an ectopic pregnancy become a case that gets litigated? How does intrauterine fetal demise become a case that's litigated? Well, what about something like cervical cancer? What about spina bifida? What about cerebral palsy? And so it is a good way for you to get that pattern recognition, and you're going to practice better medicine.
I can see how, again, a few cases I've read, you go, oh, I should probably think about these things a little bit differently. But I also think, I think about approaching it as just the clinical view, this is it. How much should the physician think about it from the legal terms? Because again, I think I can see how it would be, you're trying to understand it from one perspective or another, but at the end of the day, it is me, trying to say this is what I think is the reasonable right thing to do. Whatever you do with that information is up to you. But at the end of the day, I think, I don't know enough about it to know how much, and I guess every case is different, every lawyer is different, every relationship is different, but how much lawyers are looking for us to sort of, again, involve ourselves in a specific case outside of just providing that opinion. But
well, I'd love to give you an example. I was in the state of Rhode Island, and it was a hysterectomy case. And the patient had undergone hysterectomy and then had literally wound dehiscence of the vaginal cuff that required 3 repairs. 3. And so not only did I have to educate this attorney on the steps for hysterectomy, okay, and then he's like, well, there's different types, and would we have been better off with her getting a different type of hysterectomy, and what about her weight, and what would BMI, and what about, so here they're asking me all these questions when I had to bring them back and say, okay, we're going to talk for a moment about the differences with what's an open surgery? What's an LAVH? What is a minimally invasive hysterectomy? So they need just an enormous amount of education and information to take the case forward correctly. Because if they don't have the basic information, Mark, to take that case forward, then it becomes this emotional, look what happened to this patient and the jury, you lose objectivity there. And that's really not fair to the doctor. To keep this as, fair as possible, the attorneys need to be educated on what they're talking about. And so I showed him all this literature and data on dehiscence and the fact that there were 3 repairs, and this case did go to trial. And so the need to educate, I can't stress that enough, Mark, that it's true. It's the attorney's case. We don't own it. I'm not connected to any particular outcome. That's something very important to understand. But at the same time, you have to do your own due diligence as an expert. And this is where I think we had a little confusion earlier, but you have to do your due diligence as an expert to say, did I educate this attorney so that he truly can talk about this literature correctly? Did I educate him that he understands these basic concepts behind risk factors for dehiscence? Can he intelligently walk himself through questions that he asks a doctor about surgery? And so that's the piece where we have to be integral. We have to participate. Otherwise, the case loses objectivity. And then all of a sudden, you can induce bias due to emotion and non-scientific information entering the picture.
No, that makes good sense. I think a lot of this work, though, and I think, the way you're talking about it, clearly you've got a motive-based injustice. And I don't mean just like legal justice, but just like, doing the right thing for the right reasons and those things. We do hear about physicians who do it for money, but also will say whatever the lawyers want them to say. And, you read some of these things and you go,
Indeed.
What is this person talking about? And one of the things I think it's important to understand is the damage that can do.
Absolutely. I just encountered it last week. I just encountered it in trial.
So how do we as doctors, as a community, I think about...
We build a platform.
Well, I listen, I think not even just within your work, I mean but nationally, we have doctors out there that are not helping, not even helping other doctors. They're not helping patients. They're not helping the system by feeding into this litigious or litigious society we live in and make it harder for the real cases that need to be reviewed. And I wonder what we can do, or what you suggest that we do to improve the system, because I think the system is.
Certainly.
And then people will take advantage of opportunities within an existing system. So to fix the problem, I don't think you can make people perfect, but can you make a system that's better? How do you keep doctors from writing opinions that are clearly nonsense just to get it to trial, right? Or at least the threat of it getting to trial. It's very expensive, even if you did nothing wrong.
Correct. So I was in an experience during trial where this was, first of all, we have this term called commensurate expert. So meaning MFM evaluating MFM, GYN-ONC evaluating GYN-ONC. So, MIGS evaluating MIGS, not a generalist evaluating MFM. Okay. So we call that a commensurate expert. Sometimes these get mismatched. And that's where I find the trials can also become confusing, especially to the jury, because you have 2 experts from 2 different perspectives. So number one, I think we can improve the whole process by making sure we have something called commensurate experts. That's number one out of the gate, okay? And that's not too hard to do. It requires discipline, however, not just from attorneys, but from doctors, so that when an attorney calls you on the phone and there's a case to be had, that you ask yourself, am I a commensurate expert for this case? And in my masterclass, I give you a checklist so that when you speak to the attorney, you are coming across very well informed and very well prepared, and you will not have that pitfall, if you would, to fall into.
But again, you're assuming that the people on both sides will play to do what's right. Again, I'm getting away from what we would like it to be, because though you make good sense and would counsel your lawyer colleagues, hey, we should have someone who's, an expert in this field to weigh in, and they should too. But if they don't, again, that's so late in the game to get to. Once you've gotten to trial, the time, the energy, the depositions, the emotional toll, which we haven't even really gotten into yet, is the real impact when medical expert witnesses who are not commensurate or who are not providing what many of us would say is standard of care. Like, what is the recourse for those docs? What is the
excellent point.
Like, what do we do? The
and
answer
like I
is
said,
very little.
I
often.
hear you.
And the other big thing I wanted to get to is the secret of it all, right? When you talk about writing reports, most lawyers don't want anybody to write anything down at all. We talk about it on the phone. We'll only get to the report like once we've decided we're going to go forward with things and once we have an idea about what we're doing. But don't tell anybody anything. Don't talk about anything. If you've been sued or threatened, any conversation, any text, it's all discoverable. It is a very lonely and isolating process for many people to have to go through. It can be traumatic for many people to go through, and it oftentimes is based on a physician's opinion that may not be, as you put it, commensurate, or even suggesting it's close to the standard of care.
Totally.
So what's the way to fix that?
Okay, so let's use the example in trial where I have gone through outpatient. This was regarding an outpatient assessment. So I've looked at ACOG Technical Bulletin 365, which is giving and receiving consultation. There are 9 parameters in that bulletin that if we were consulted, we're required to meet those. And I'm putting in a huge plug for 365. Everyone, please look at it. Long and short is that, here I am giving this very technical rendition of, yes, the doctor did what they were asked to do. Their record supports it. And that's that. And then for another expert to stand up who is worse from still an Ivy League situation and saying, well, I have 6 children and I'm an OBGYN. And if I were a mother, this would just wrench my heart and I'd be so sick over it. Excuse me, you're there to be a scientist, you're there to be a doctor, and you're there to cite what we call a medical expert. The law defines it as knowledge, experience, training, and or education. So she's not there to be a mother of 6 or 7 children. I respect her wholeheartedly. I'm a mother too. I have a 2 disabled children, but that's not what I bring to the table as a medical expert. So you're right, Mark. An expert can sway a jury utilizing this bias. And then you ask yourself, okay, well then how do we work against that? How do we rectify that? And it's a very difficult question. My thought process is for us all to just not tolerate it from each other. And there does not exist right now either a platform or any recourse, and within ACOG, the bylaws, etc. There's only one small paragraph within the bylaws for ACOG that if you're misrepresenting yourself as an expert, you could lose your board certification.
Yeah, and that's it.
So that's it.
But then think about the process of it's a challenging thing to do for anybody, and at that point, it's you have to basically go to trial, right, to get to that point, or else.
But that's another reason why I just prefer, Mark, to get it to deposition where they can hash it out and come up with a solution that works for everyone. And this way, everyone asks me, why do you want to avoid trial? Well, like I said, trial doesn't always result in the outcome with the most justice.
And my son does debate, and he was frustrated because he's a bright kid and does all his homework and knows the facts, but he's got some work to do when it comes to convincing people of his ideas. And he's like, it's a popularity contest. I said, welcome to life. You can have all the facts, but if you're a good storyteller and you can sway people, and it's politics. It's not just the truth. It's not just the facts, right? It is making a connection. It is understanding who your audience is. I've got family in show business, and then much of this is really just, to your point, no, I think there's a lot more reason than in a deposition setting where you have people having conversations versus this big unknown, you don't know who the judge is going to be, you don't know who the jury is going to be, all these things that are just
Precisely.
Totally out of your control. No, so I can see that.
And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here to speak with you, because this is something that I think we're really doing a fine job at getting this out in our community and having that discussion. And my hope and my goal over time is to be able to rejoin your podcast in the future and share the cases that I'm seeing and share some, like I said, of these patterns that are occurring, that when you walk onto a labor floor, you're doing a hysterectomy, or all of us, you're assisting with a hysterectomy, your mind is going to be developed just like a muscle to see, oh, this is not a pattern. I recognize this pattern. We need to rope it back. We need to do something else. And so that's why I'm here this evening, to share this with my colleagues and tell them, you know what? There is a lot you can do to protect yourself. There is a lot you can do to reduce your stress and your burnout, because what you're worried about, if you'd learn about it more, you wouldn't be as, subject to worry and ignorance.
Well, I think you've got an additional opportunity here. Now, I'm a CMO at an academic medical center. Again, I always think in terms of systems, right? Like we have, all these people coming through, they all have their strengths. Their focus should be in a very narrow window of activity, right? So you want your orthopedic surgeon doing their thing and nothing else. I don't want them worrying about this stuff. I want them focused on the patient. I want them to make smart choices and those things, obviously, clinically. But the part that I want to know about as an administrator, as a leader, as a systems leader, health system leader, is how do we build systems that minimize error, minimize opportunity for, gaps in care, and maximize our documentation and clarity in our work, right? And having policies and protocols that make it really easy to follow. More importantly, make it really hard not to follow. Because again, this idea that people are perfect,
indeed,
forget it. Like that's
its own podcast.
First thing, we've talked about. That was my residency grand rounds was on wellness and well-being and burnout, and that was in 2010, long before folks were talking about it.
Excellent.
And in 2012, I talked about failure in medicine and how I think, again, this myth of perfectibility, the yoke of perfection, and how I think it actually, inhibits, we select for these kind of people.
It does.
But I think it inhibits our ability to do good care in many ways, and thinking about.
It does.
Whereas, as you understand that, Institute of Medicine's 1999 study on failure and bad outcomes, there are almost always systems problems, right? People doing good work and bad things happens, but we as people.
Patterns. Mm-hmm.
So I think the additional work, is what you're doing is real work and it's important work. But I think there's another big opportunity in working with the risk management folks in your hospital. And we've got great ones where I am. My goodness, are they good? But they're always thinking in that way. They are always wanting to know, how do we keep our patients safe, our providers safe? How do we keep this really complex ecosystem moving along in a way that minimizes the opportunity for these things?
Fatigue, apathy, 1 and 2. You show me, when I review a case, fatigue, apathy.
Oh yeah, burnout. Mistakes lead to burnout. Lead to
show me a case of cerebral palsy, for example, and I go through the monitoring strips, and 80% of the monitoring doesn't exist. There were loss of contact. There's just blank sheets of paper. And 20% of the fetal heart rate's recorded, and 80% is just not there. So like I said, apathy, fatigue. And so fatigue,
but those
think
are
about
human
airline
problems,
pilots.
Right?
Correct.
But why do airlines, why is the failure from the airline industry microscopic, right? I mean, if we could approach 100th of the error rate of the airline industry, you would see rates plummet. I mean, it's an incredible.
Here's where I give credit to my brother-in-law, formerly in the Air Force, Jonathan, and he is in training and now applying to be a commercial airline pilot. And what I see is they're working 12 hours at a time. They are not to work over 12 hours. Now, you shift that to our industry, where, an insurance policy is more expensive if the more physicians you insure, even if they're on 12-hour shifts. So it's easier to insure one doctor for a 24-hour shift than two doctors for two 12s. Okay, that's more expensive. Why is that? Where is the consideration of the big picture? So to me, that's the elephant in the room. How do we get these logistics, if you would? And yes, absolutely. Let's look at other industries, as you mentioned. There's a really great book, and I give credit to my former program director. He's an OBGYN, and he was CEO over at Jefferson, Dr. Stephen Klasko, and he wrote a book called Bless This Mess. And it's a great way to introduce yourself into all the dynamics that you're describing, Mark.
It's a life's work, something that I think about a lot, and systems and those things. But when I think about medical legal work, is one, that there is a legal system that exists, and it's also highly variable state to state, and there's all these differences and ubiquities when it comes to this part of it. But one of the things that I was talking to a colleague about, not in healthcare or the legal system, talked about pro se lawsuits. Do you know what that is? Pro se, yeah. So AI, somebody had used AI to write a legal challenge, to write a lawsuit, and you can file it without a lawyer, pro se, and it's free.
Correct.
And it's free for the person filing. It is anything but free for the person who has to defend it, and even if it's nonsense.
Correct.
So this is something that, unless we get ahead of it, unless we think about how to design systems to keep patients safe, keep physicians from, doing good work, but also protecting them and to do this work, because you don't get into this work in general because you want to hurt people. It's really hard to become a doctor and a nurse and a tech and all these people that work in healthcare. And we got to protect each other. We got to protect each other to do this really important work. It's valuable work. And so to protect them and doing what you're doing is valuable work as well. So like things like AI, what are things that you think about in the future? What are things that you sort of, you stay up at night worrying about for this kind of work, or that you're trying to plan for, prep for?
Well, first of all, the AI challenge, obviously the glass is half, I look at the glass as half full, not half empty. So I ask the question of how can AI serve us to provide not just better services as a medical expert, but as a physician, et cetera. Now, in terms of the limitations, and like you said, it'll mean that anyone can file anything. But here's the challenge, and I'm going to use obstetrics as an example. Okay, when it comes to an obstetrics case, and I'm called by an attorney, and they say, I have this case. This one is postpartum hemorrhage with Sheehan syndrome. This one is spina bifida. This one is this or that. I'm like, okay, the record is between 10 and 12,000 pages long on average, especially if you include all the fetal heart rate monitoring strips. So you're looking at a record in excess of 1,000 pages. That still costs money to litigate. So the reality is that you can file anything you want to with AI. You're still going to have to back up the costs of defending it and moving it forward. So that's why I really, I agree with you that anyone can file anything, but there's still that mechanism in place that you have two sides and they both have to be able to fund such a situation.
Does the pro se filer have to fund anything?
Well, they will have to eventually.
They have to hire a lawyer to go to trial, or they can't? I guess that's just the filing that they're doing for free. You can't go to trial without a lawyer.
Exactly.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, that, and what about, there have to be selection of experts, there have to be depositions, et cetera. So
that's a really
bottom
good point.
line is that
it's still not cheap.
Yeah. And it's not. In fact, I get called by firms that have a very, strong reputation. And they're like, well, we don't do a lot of obstetrics. I have to educate them that the cost of taking an obstetrics case to trial is typically in the $200,000 to $250,000 range. And that is more of the utilization of all the costs, meaning you look at okay, you need an MFM expert, and then you need a nursing expert. Well, now you need a generalist. Okay, well, now we need an administrative expert. If you have 7 or 8 different experts that are all lined up in a given case, that has to, that's a cost. And so that has to be carried forward. So if you're filing a case and you
That's a
don't
really
have
good point.
that momentum, so, and some of these firms, what they do is they literally take out credit lines to fund it because of, the fact that they don't know how many experts they're going to need, Mark, until we start going through the case.
Well, the other thing I'm hearing about is private equity getting involved and hedging against these cases and funding some of these cases and trying to get a return.
Indeed.
And so I think this is something when we're a little short on time, and I appreciate you coming on and chatting. There's a lot we could talk about, but these are the kinds of things that whenever there's a crack, whenever there's an opportunity or an opening, I mean, folks are going to try to get at that. And so it's the kind of thing that
Indeed.
as we're learning about these things, we as health care leaders, as medical expert leaders, as community of folks trying to do good work, how do we build a better system to allow patients to have an opportunity address potential malpractice? That's an important part of this. We absolutely should support that, but in a way that is that doesn't cripple the system. And I think there's got to be a better balance to that than we currently have. So I appreciate you coming on. It sounds like you've got a great thing going there.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about going forward. And at some point down the road, get you back on and we can continue the conversation.
Sounds wonderful, Mark. And again, thank you so much. I truly appreciate meeting you, and welcome. Any of my colleagues, please give me a call. I would love to speak with you. We'll hear your stories out and see how I can help. I would just love to help you to just make the most out of your OBGYN career. You don't have to, like when I went home to my house at the end of the pandemic with my son, and I had no job and no idea what I was going to do and had to totally shift gears. There's a great way to practice OBGYN, and it's different for all of us, and I'm here to help you find that.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mark. Have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to follow the podcast, rate it 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, direct message us at _BackTable OBGYN on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. BackTable OBGYN is hosted by myself, Mark Hoffman,
and Amy Park.
Our production team is led by Kieran Gannon,
Aaron Bowles,
Gabe D'Agrazio,
and Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz, with support from
Taylor Spurgeon-Hess and Yvonne Orgoginski.
Show notes and social media by Emma Landenwich
and Lindsay Beecham. Administrative support provided by Judy Dela Cruz.
Music written and performed by Scott Baby Daddy Hoffman.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on BackTable OBGYN are their own, and do not reflect the views or positions of their employers or any entities they represent.